Thank you so much, Melissa. The research Gail, Michelle, and David are doing is absolutely critical, really, to our understanding of the issues we will need to address in a national action plan. So thank you again. Personal experiences, journeys, and the understanding they bring are another key to learning. It is my pleasure now to introduce our lived experience keynote speaker, Dr. Margot Feldman. Is a writer, educator, and community builder who believes that we can heal ourselves and our world through the soft magic of collaboration, accountability, mutual care, curiosity, compassion, and community. They are currently at work on a memoir entitled The Bed of Sickness, Essays on Care. Welcome, Dr. Feldman.
Hello. And folks, I'm not seeing myself pop up in the screen here, so I just want to make sure that we are all here and seeing me, because I'm just seeing the slide with my photo on it. So I'm gonna pause for a second as I maybe just wait for a little tech support to bring me up. Okay, here we go. Hi, everyone. I'm so grateful to be here today, to be the lived experience keynote. It's really, really moving for me to see all of you here talking about how to build a better workplace for those of us living with episodic disabilities. I thought I'd begin by doing a bit of a deeper dive into who I am and the work that I do in the world, as that will provide some context for my lived experience. So I spent the last 8 years earning my PhD in English literature and sexual diversity studies at the University of Toronto and successfully defended my dissertation just last month. During my time in the PhD program, I created award-winning pedagogy programs, including teaching queerly, and events like the Sick Theories Conference, which received over $15,000 in grants, awards, and funding. I've also worked as a teaching assistant and course instructor at U of T, and have created workshops and published academic articles on how to bring a trauma-informed approach to how we practice accessibility in the university classroom and in policymaking more broadly. During my time in the program, I started to write creatively and have had my essays published in various literary magazines. Through self-publishing and my public education work, which focused largely on my lived experience with chronic illness and trauma, I grew an Instagram following of over 20,000 people, which is pretty wild, and used that platform to launch my business in providing one-on-one peer support to folks living with trauma and chronic illness. As part of my activism, I also do consulting on issues of queer and trans inclusivity, financial accessibility, and trauma-informed approaches. I like to wear many hats, but at the heart of all of the work that I do is this desire to answer this question. In a world that works to oppress and divide us, how do we care for one another and ourselves? This question and my desire to answer it is informed by my intersecting identities. I'm a queer, non-binary femme. I come from a poor working class family. I'm the first person on my dad's side of the family to go to university, the first on my mom's side to go to graduate school, and the only person on either side to earn a PhD. And I did so while living with 2 episodic disabilities, complex trauma and fibromyalgia. The reality is that I've lived with complex trauma for the majority of my life, with fibromyalgia joining the party just a few years ago in my early 30s. While these diagnoses are fairly recent, I've known sickness and disability for most of my life. My mother died of cervical cancer when I was 11, and shortly after her death, my father developed a rare form of ALS, or more commonly known as Lou Gehrig's disease. Only 10% of people with ALS live longer than 10 years, and my father was in that 10%, living with the disease for 20 years before his death in 2017. As one of my father's primary caregivers, I learned a lot about the struggles of navigating an ableist world as a disabled person and the accommodations one might need. And yet that didn't prepare me for becoming disabled myself, especially as someone with episodic disabilities. And so in between doctor's appointments, I did what any good graduate student would do. I looked for myself in the pages of literature. I turned to disability studies scholarship, but found that almost all of the literature focused on those living with permanent, visible, and non-episodic disabilities. And so the intersections of chronic illness and trauma became the focal point of my dissertation research and resulted in my PhD dissertation, Touch Me, I'm Sick, Hysterical Intimacies, Sick Theories. Given the lack of research and study on episodic disabilities and the wide-ranging symptoms and experiences that they bring with them, it can be hard to know what kinds of accommodations one might need and how to make those accommodations possible in the workplace. I feel like it would be useful to tell you a little bit about what it looks like to live with complex trauma and fibromyalgia. And then I'll share what it looked like for me to ask for accommodations at my last full-time job. Technically, complex post-traumatic stress disorder is a contested diagnosis, as it has yet to be acknowledged by the Bible, that is, the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders, otherwise known as the DSM. The DSM does, however, include post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. PTSD is caused by a singular traumatic event, such as a sexual assault, a car accident, or going to war. PTSD brings with it a whole host of symptoms, including panic attacks, disordered sleep, dissociation, flashbacks, intrusive thoughts, and debilitating depression. Complex trauma, on the other hand, is caused by multiple or ongoing traumas. This can include growing up in a home with neglectful or emotionally abusive caregivers, acting as a caregiver to siblings or parents while you were still a child, living in poverty and chronically chaotic housing, witnessing or experiencing community violence, or being subject to a life-threatening health situation. The reality is that the world that we live in is pretty deeply traumatizing. And there are way more people walking around with trauma than we've been taught to think. In my dissertation, I demonstrate the link between chronic illness and trauma as one that's undeniable. Researchers and doctors and mental health providers are letting go of this mind-body dualism that we inherited in the 18th century. It has become clear that unprocessed trauma manifests itself in the body, showing up as autoimmune diseases, including ALS, and chronic illnesses such as fibromyalgia. Fibromyalgia begins with the nervous system's fight or flight response, which, in trying to keep us safe from danger, inhibits deep sleep. And this lack of deep sleep sets off a chain reaction that prevents adequate growth hormone release, which interferes with muscle tissue repair and leads to muscle pain. As a response to this pain, muscles and their surrounding connective tissues are chronically tightened. And so the nervous system becomes hyperreactive to pain. I'll translate this into what fibro pain looks like for me. It feels like I've done the most intense gym workout of my life and am coming down with the season's worst flu virus. My limbs feel like lead, my brain slows down, my executive functioning vanishes, and moving my body feels, at its worst, impossible. My high pain flares are often accompanied by sharp pains and shocks in my elbows and wrists, which make it hard to do most, if any, of the work that I do in the world, which involves being at my laptop. When I have a hard night sleeping, I know that I'll have a fibro flare the next day. When I push myself too hard and don't have enough rest time, I know that a fibro flare is coming. When old trauma gets triggered, a fibro flare usually comes with it. When the pain first began about 3 to 4 years ago, every day was like a 5 to an 8 on the pain scale. I took an unofficial leave from my PhD program that first summer and spent most of my days on my couch, moving between sleep and pain. Since then, with the help of somatic trauma therapy, my everyday pain is around a 2 to a 4. The pain is always there, but it feels a little bit more just like a dull ache. Now, because I'm able to ascertain what's causing higher pain days and address the source, the flare usually passes in about 1 to 2 days. And it's possible that eventually I may no longer experience chronic pain. So how have these diagnoses impacted my capacity to work, and what do accommodations look like for me? 2 summers ago, I was hired for a paid internship at the University of Toronto's Student Leadership Development Program. This was the first time since receiving my diagnosis that I'd be working a full-time 9 to 5 job. Prior to this, the only time I worked more than 30 hours a week was when it was time for grading, and even then, I'd usually pause my academic work and focus exclusively on grading so as not to overwork myself and set off a pain flare. My work days were 5 to 6 hours max. My schedule was almost entirely my own. And so when I had bad days or even weeks of pain, I could stay home and rest, coming to campus just on the days where I had to teach. For this internship, I was expected to work 35 hours a week with 7-hour days in an office on the U of T campus, which meant that I'd be commuting 20 to 30 minutes each way. And for the most part, I was able to do that. But there's a difference between being able to do something and actually honoring your body's needs. And I feel like this is a really big struggle point for those of us living with chronic illnesses. Not only did I have to push through my own internalized ableism and the story that I should just be able to show up to work just like everyone else in the world, or else I was lazy, I also had to push through the fear that I'd be fired at worst or ostracized at best for needing accommodations. Thankfully, my boss knew that I was disabled because of the work I'd been doing at U of T around accessibility. My disability wasn't a secret. And in fact, my lived experience with disability was considered an asset at my job, as I was asked to undertake an accessibility audit of all of the program offerings. Knowing that my disabilities were seen as valuable, not just acceptable, helped me make my accommodation requests. that I'd get to work from home on days where I had pain flares, that I'd be able to work a half day on Wednesdays so that I could keep my weekly therapy appointments, which are a major tool for me for managing my symptoms, that I could come to work wearing casual, comfy clothes on days where I was experiencing pain but still needed to come in, and that I could take breaks as needed throughout my day to stretch and move my body. Knowing that there was not only space for, but acceptance of my disabilities played a key role in me successfully completing my 4-month internship. I feel, though, that I was one of the lucky ones. Since completing this internship, I've transitioned into working freelance. As someone who grew up poor, giving up the idea of a stable 9-to-5 job was really challenging for my trauma brain. But the flexibility of being my own boss, who can set my own hours and reschedule work as my body needs, has provided me with so much ease and mental stability. I don't have to be worried about being fired for being sick all the time. I don't have to worry about advocating for my access needs. I can prioritize my mental and physical health without having to use up my sick days, if I even have sick days to begin with, or losing pay. While I'm confident that I am actually just really happy being my own boss, I'd still love to see workplaces adopt policies that normalize different access needs. We've been taught that disabled people are the only ones who need accommodations. But I think we'd find that everyone would be a better worker if they had more flexibility in how they worked. In closing, I want to leave you with a few questions to think about. What would it look like if, at every job interview, employers asked you what your access needs were and shared their own? What if we flipped the script and instead of you, the precarious employee, asking for accommodations, your boss asked you if you'd like to work from home or come into the office? What if, like me, you were hired not in spite of your disability, but because your disability was seen as an asset to the workplace? What if accessibility wasn't the exception, but the rule? And finally, what does a trauma-informed workplace look like? How do we integrate policies that support the mental health of all workers? And I ask this last question in particular because for the past year, we've been living through a collective trauma with the COVID-19 pandemic. We've yet to see the full depth and scope of how this traumatic event will impact us, but I hope that you'll take a proactive approach in thinking about how to address this when, at some point, maybe, workplaces transition back into pre-pandemic times, if such a transition is even possible. I have many thoughts and feelings on that last point in particular, but I'd like to save space for questions and discussion. And so I'll end things there. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Dr. Feldman. Your personal journey and your insight with us is invaluable. So thank you for sharing that with us. I'm going to open the floor up to Melissa now for some questions.
Thank you so much. You have grounded the issues in such an incredible way. I truly appreciate your voice being part of the summit. Yeah, thank you. I have a few questions from the Q&A for you. The first one is, can the biopsychosocial model of therapy, is that the best approach to deal with PTSD, especially for immigrants who have experienced severe systemic racism and unconscious bias?
Yeah, I mean, I think, my approach is very much using like the nested model, which is one that doesn't just look at the individual, and, their own just personal like history, like more intimately in their life, but that looks at family, community, and, just the world writ large. We are still really moving out of this approach to addressing PTSD that looks at it as an individual like flaw that is in need of some cure, and towards a model that really addresses the fact that the world we live in is traumatizing, and people are, especially from marginalized groups, and the more intersections of marginalization there are, the higher the prevalence of trauma is. And so we can't just be thinking about the individual, because there's really only so much work that I can do to heal my own trauma when I go back out into a world that is transphobic, that is, still grounded in rape culture, that is deeply ableist, because those forces are really what underlies all of the traumatic experiences that we go through. Sexual assault happens because of misogyny and rape culture. So there are, and I think about, those of us who have had to go through the medical system to get diagnosed for having chronic illness. I'm definitely one of the lucky ones in having a very deeply understanding doctor who really let me advocate and really believed me. But, it's way more common for folks to have been disbelieved, to have been told that they're hysterical, that they are making up their symptoms. And so again, we really need to address how the larger systemic forces are playing a part in the traumas that so many of us are living through.
Okay, thank you. I have time for one more question, so I'm just going to pick the next one. The next question is, you mentioned trauma therapy. What is that?
Yeah, great question.
Huge question.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many different modalities of therapy. I have been in cognitive behavioral therapy, I've been in relational therapy, I've been in Gestalt therapy, and they've all served me in different ways, and I think I needed them. Trauma-specific therapy, and you would think that all therapy would be trauma-informed, but I'm going to tell you that it's not. No one really used the word trauma with me until, I was probably like a good 5-7 years into my own therapy work. And so trauma therapy specifically is like addressing the roots of the symptoms that we're experiencing. And so, I'd been given diagnoses of chronic anxiety, severe paranoia, only to realize many, many years later that those are actually just symptoms of trauma and how it shows up in the body. And so with, and there's many different modalities of different kinds of trauma therapy. But the other thing that's really important and that trauma therapy should be doing is really looking at the body. Trauma lives in our bodies. This is, one of the big revelations that's really been happening over the last, especially 5 years. There is a longer history of this research, but really in the past 5 or so years, this recognition that addressing trauma with just like a cognitive approach is not going to get us really down into the root of what's going to support our healing.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for being part of the summit, truly. If you have a few moments, there are a number of questions in the question and answer box. If you've got a few seconds to address those for those individuals who were curious, please do that. Thank you again for being a part of the day. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, thank you again, Dr. Feldman. We certainly have a lot to think about already from all of the presentations so far. We've reached that point in the agenda, though, to keep up our energy. We're going to take a quick 10-minute break. So feel free to get up, stretch, do whatever you need to do, but please stay logged on to the Zoom session. We don't want you to log out. When we come back, we will have one more presentation that we rescheduled from Tuesday's session, and then we will move on to a facilitated large group discussion. We will have a countdown clock on the screen to let you know when it's time to resume after our break. Thanks so much and enjoy.